Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
On this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast, I have a familiar guest, Mike Drues with Vascular Sciences, join me. And this one was kind of fun because we went into a time machine of sorts and revisited sort of I guess, our origin story, if you will, the moment that connected Mike and I and led to all of the things that you all have grown to appreciate that we share on the Global Medical Device Podcast. So I really want you to enjoy this episode. It was fun for me. It was fun for Mike. But before you do, I didn't have a chance to share this on the podcast. You know, the first time that he and I connected was back in late 2014. And what I appreciate most about my relationship with Mike Drues is that he has caused me to think about the world a lot differently, specifically within the med device space. But just because there's a rule or regulation, it's not black and white. And I need to think for myself, and I need to understand what's important to the patient that's involved with the thing that I'm doing, and so on and so forth. I mean, to quote something that Mike talks about, or paraphrase anyway, he sees his role largely as teaching others how to think, not what to think. And I think that's really profound. So again, enjoy this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, Jon Speer. And I thought we would, have a little fun today. I hope that's okay with all of you listening. And the fun that I want to have is, first and foremost, familiar guest of the Global Medical Device Podcast, Mike Drues with Vascular Sciences, has joined me. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Jon.
You're welcome. And the other day, you and I were just kind of, reminiscing might be the right word, or reminding ourselves sort of our origin story, how we got connected to one another. And I thought we would dive into that a little bit, certainly for maybe a few laughs and memories and things of that nature. But more importantly, the topic that connected us, at least originally, is still one that seems to be an area of struggle and challenge for the industry. So there will be something topical and meaningful and helpful through this as well. But does that sound okay with you?
I think that's great, Jon. And it's one of the questions I get when I meet some of our fans, so to speak, is they ask the question of how is it that how is it that this started? How did we get together? So I'm looking forward to today's discussion as well.
All right. Well, let's take a moment to go in the Wayback Machine. And, this was December of 2014. And at that point in time, Greenlight was still pretty new company. But, I'm scouring the internet and consuming all this wonderful content. And I come across this podcast titled, "Do You Make These Design Control Mistakes?" And I listened to it. And the person on the other end of that podcast was Mike Drues. And it sort of sparked or triggered a reaction in me, to which I then followed up with a sort of rebuttal of that. I heard Mike say this, and this is what I believe, and that sort of thing. And I know you remember that pretty well. Yeah,
Jon, you know what? You're being very kind. I would say that you did to me what the bleeding edge tried to do to the medical device.
Oh, now that's
in your column. But seriously, let me explain further. And this is, why I think both of us wanted to have this discussion today. I think that you raised a number of legitimate points. But, to be fair, when I read your response to my podcast, my feathers were a little ruffled. But you know what? I'm a fan of the old adage, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I didn't know you at that time. So I said, you know what? I'm going to think that I'm a wackadoodle, if not, worse. And, maybe, try to better understand. And long story short, Jon, and I don't want to put words in in your mouth. I think that the more we talked after that initial conversation, and the more we've spoken since then over the last, about 6 years or so, I think that we're singing exactly the same songs, just maybe in a very, very slightly different key. But I think fundamentally, we have a lot more similarities than differences. Would you agree?
Totally, and I have to give you all the credit in the world, because you, even though something that I said or wrote might have been a little bit of a feather ruffler, to your credit, you reached out. You said, "Hey, let's get on the phone and let's talk." And I remember that day that I remember where I was very vividly, the day that you and I spoke on the phone, and this was the I'll say the more. I'll say the more angry version of Jon. Not that I was angry, but I'm certainly those that know me today, I'm pretty calm and at peace with everything. But I was prepared for a battle when you and I got on the phone. To be quite honest, I don't think I've ever shared this with you. And then as you and I spoke, it was like, to your point, yeah, we're both on the same page here. We are passionate about medical device product development and design controls and prudent engineering and all those sorts of things. And, I'm happy that was a birth of a wonderful relationship.
Well, I am as well, Jon. And, I don't want to just be reminiscent here. I also want to be pragmatic. What I'd like to do is I've taken a recent reread through your blog that you wrote in response to my podcast. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to talk about a few of the points that you made. And regrettably, as we both know, a lot of companies seem to continue to make these mistakes over and over, even today. So I don't want anybody to feel like just because, this started 6 years ago, it's ancient history and it doesn't apply. On the contrary, I think everything still applies 100% as much today, maybe even more, as it did 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So one of the points that I made in my podcast, Jon, and this is a recurring theme in several of our conversations since then, is that I think the root cause, to use the engineering vernacular, of so many companies getting in trouble with the FDA is because they try to focus more on what the regulation says as opposed to trying to understand and follow the intent of the regulation, or what I call the regulatory logic. And you responded in your blog, Jon, and this is a direct quote from you, to state that the root cause of why companies are confused about design controls because the focus is on regulation is just wrong, close quote. And so I'm just wondering, Jon, do you think maybe you've had a little bit of an epiphany since then? Or is that still your belief that it's sufficient for companies to focus on what the regulation says, i.e. the letter of the law, as opposed to its intent, the spirit of the law?
Yeah, see, I think, that's a really good point. And thanks for reminding me of my words and putting me on the spot. My intention behind that statement was not that it wasn't about interpretation of or following the regulations per se, one way or the other. It was more about, I don't think that's the problem that companies are struggling with. I think there's almost the theme that I see a lot. It's not that there's a resistance to compliance, but there sort of is. It's like companies they sort of ignore the regulations more than anything else. I don't see a lot of companies that are trying to strictly interpret each of the design control regulations to the letter. I see there's like this exercise more so that not that they're trying to avoid it either. It's just that it's almost like they don't even know the regulations exist.
Well, if they don't know the regulations exist, that's indicative of a whole other set of problems, Jon. But let's start to peel this onion back a little bit further. Another of the comments that I made in that original podcast was that the design controls were very vague, and they were written purposely very vague because the medical device industry is a very broad industry, and they need to be able to be applied to everything from Band-Aids to artificial hearts. In response to that, Jon, you said that, again, this is a direct quote, medical device companies are confused about design controls because the regulations are too vague. So I guess the question to you is, do you think that vagueness is a good thing or a bad thing? In other words, I view, vague, nebulous, non-specific regulation to be a huge advantage for many reasons, as we've talked about over the last 6 years, Jon. But I guess my question to you is, do you think that because they're vague, is that good or bad for medical device companies?
Well, I think it's good, and I agree with your point. I think the challenge, and this isn't necessarily my belief. I'm just sharing anecdotes of what I hear for people. A lot of medical device professionals, a lot of times even medical device product development professionals, I think they're looking to be spoon-fed. And you and I have talked a lot about sort of this theme in the past. Like they want FDA to tell them what to do, when to do it, how to do it, or at least that's what they say. And as you and I have talked over the years, I would doubt that if that became the reality that people would actually like that. I think the challenge that people have with the vagueness of the regulations is they're not thinking. You know, they don't take it to the next level. They don't take the vague regulations and interpret what those mean to them and their company. I think that's the challenge. So does that make sense?
Yes. And taking it a step or two further, regrettably, I do agree with you that it seems today, and of course this is a stereotype, there are exceptions, but more and more people, they literally want to be spoon-fed. They want to be led like sheep. They want to be told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, whether it's from the FDA or somebody else. And I see this, never mind in companies in the industry and in FDA, I see it in my academic teaching and my graduate students who, we're not teaching people how to think anymore. We're teaching people how to, just simply follow a recipe. And let me just remind you, Jon, is something I've said in many of our conversations, when we meet the regulatory requirements, that's just being a C student. So the question is, do we, and I'll leave this as a rhetorical question, do we need anybody, including the FDA, to tell us to do things that as medical device professionals, we should know to do these things anyway? And I'm sorry if this sounds a bit harsh, Jon, but people that don't know certain basic things, they shouldn't be in this business. I mean, I had a situation once. I don't know if I shared this in a previous. I don't know if I shared this in a previous conversation, Jon. I had a company call me. They were working on an implant, a device that was going to go inside somebody's body. And among other things, I asked them, well, where are you on your biocompatibility testing? And they said, what's that?
My goodness.
I mean, there are certain things that if you're going to, Chad, you're laughing. I wish I could say that I was making this up. I am not making this up. This is exactly why we have a lot of the regulation that we have. Right. But anyway, let's move on because I think, again, I want to use this as constructively as I can so that people, stop, quite frankly, making the same mistakes over and over again. So another of the things that I talked about in my podcast is design inputs and outputs and verification and validation. And one of the things that you pointed out in your blog response is that what the sponsor should do is prove that the medical device that they designed and developed is designed and developed correctly. And the question that I have for you, Jon, is what does correctly mean and how do we show it?
Yeah.
For example, when we get into verification and validation, it's, as you know, it's all about showing that we've met the needs of the user and so on. In other words, did we design the right device? Did we design the device right? But here's a question for you, Jon. Where in the design controls or anywhere in the regulation does it ask us the question, did we ask the right question? Did we solve the right problem? In other words, what good is getting the right answer if we're asking the wrong question? Thoughts on that one, Jon? Because I see it so many times. There's an that I used to say to my medical students, the surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. Well, the engineering equivalent, we designed the medical device perfectly, but the patient died anyway. The regulatory or quality equivalent, we followed the regulation perfectly, but the patient died anyway. So how do we know that we're designing and developing the device correctly, to use your words?
Yeah, and this is a great point that if someone were to follow a literal interpretation of regulations and not think for themselves, they may have a perfect design history file, a perfect set of inputs and outputs and verification that shows that they perfectly did everything. To me, this is all about understanding the core of why the device is being designed and developed to begin with. What problem are you trying to solve? What clinical issue are you trying to address? And I think this is an area where a lot of people really miss the mark, is because they forget about capturing the user needs. I mean, if you go to the 82030 regulations, there's no section that's explicitly states user needs. There is one for design inputs, there are for outputs, et cetera, but there's nothing that explicitly says user needs, thou shalt do this per se. Now, if you go to the FDA design control guidance document, which I still think to this day is a really, really good guidance document, there's this infamous waterfall diagram that shows user needs starting the whole cascade of things. But a lot of people sort of forget about that. And I think that leads to problems. I mean, they don't understand what's important to the end user. They don't understand what's important from the patient perspective. They don't capture that information. They make assumptions. And I think when people make assumptions, like I did this for the first couple of years of my career. I would start a project based on what I thought I understood. I would put my heads down for literally months, defining requirements and building prototypes and doing testing and so on and so forth. And I would come out of verification and say, look, my device I designed it correctly. It meets all those requirements that I defined. And then you start to put it in the hands of users, and you realize, oh, wow, I really missed something here. I forgot about that voice of user. And I think that's a problem.
Hey everyone, Connor Romali here from Greenlight Guru. Have you ever implemented a paper-based quality system with a customer and just know, once the project ends, they're going to struggle maintaining compliance on paper? If so, check out our partner programs page and let's chat about changing the future of quality management.
I agree with you, John. I think that is a problem, no doubt. However, I would offer that there's an even bigger problem here that happens before we get to any of the stuff that you just mentioned. And that is, one of the underlying tenets of the entire design controls is, as you just described, to make sure that our device meets the needs of the user. Well, the underlying assumption there is that the user knows what they need. And I learned as a biomedical engineer a long time ago not to make that assumption. In other words, why would we assume that our user knows, in fact, what they really need? They probably know what they think they need, but do they know what they really need? And I'll give you one or two quick examples to illustrate. If I have a catheter, for example, a user, a cardiologist or some other kind of physician might say, gee, this is a pretty good catheter or stent, but if I take this catheter and make it a little longer, a little shorter, a little fatter, a little thinner, I can use it for something totally different. That's what I call evolutionary product development. On the contrary, what is the likelihood of a cardiologist or a physician saying, this is a pretty good catheter, this is a pretty good stent, but if I take a gene that can turn off hyperplasia and put it inside of a virus and deliver that on the surface of a stent, now I can do something really, as we would say, coming from Boston, John, wicked cool. That is revolutionary product development. Yeah. So one of the most significant limitations of the design controls is that it makes the assumption that the user knows, in fact, what they really need. Or to use an even simpler metaphor, John, and I may have mentioned this in some of our other discussions. Today, cars are ubiquitous, but back in the day, there were no cars, and everybody was riding horses. So imagine we were, diligent engineers following the design controls, and we were trying to come up with a better mode of transportation than a horse. And we surveyed our users. We asked our users what would they like to see in a better mode of transportation. Well, I'm pretty sure, John, most people are going to say, I want a stronger horse, I want a bigger horse, I want a faster horse. But they're all going to, look like horses. Most of them are not going to say, gee, a horse is pretty good, but what I really want is a car. So there's two limitations that I just want to point out, and you can say you agree or you disagree, John. One is the underlying assumption is that the user knows what they really want. And then the second, and even more frustrating to me as an engineer, is that most of the regulation, including the design controls, it pretty much encourages evolutionary product development. And at the same time, it doesn't encourage or maybe even discourages revolutionary product development. Yeah. That's what I think, John. Would you agree or disagree?
I guess I hadn't thought of it exactly the way you just framed it. And as you were sharing that, I had a thought. We'll leave it maybe as a rhetorical question for now, or maybe one to explore at a later time. But, I do think that you're spot on with something here. It's almost like, you and I have talked about regulatory strategy and regulatory submissions and things of that nature a few times in the past. And there's a preponderance for people to want to go down this 510K path because it's, for a litany of reasons, some of which I could speculate. They perceive it's easier, more straightforward, yada, yada, so on and so forth. Which, to your point, I think that illustrates your point. The preponderance for people to lean into or to prefer the 510K regulatory path lends itself very well to your theory.
Yeah, I think, regrettably, you're right. That's the regulatory equivalent on the quality side to what we're just talking about in terms of design controls. And you might remember, Jon, a moment ago I asked you the question, you said in your blog to make sure that the device is designed and developed correctly. And I asked you how to do that.
Yeah.
Well, it was a little bit of a loaded question, Jon, because you provided an answer in your counterpoint. You said the purpose of design validation is to demonstrate that the device meets the user needs. Design validation is proof that product designed and developed is the correct product, close quote. So what you said in your blog, Jon, at least 6 years ago, was as long as you meet the needs of your user, then you are designing the correct product. And my question, and again, I'll leave this as a rhetorical one as you want, is just because we show via validation that we meet the needs of the user, does that necessarily imply that we've designed the correct device? I personally don't think so, but maybe you or other people might have a different view. And one other thing I would just say, in addition to that, Jon, I find it interesting how so many companies, they do validations. It's required, for so many things. But rarely ever do I see a company validating their validation.
Yeah.
And in fact, Jon, you may remember fairly recently, I did one of my webinars for Greenlight on exactly that topic, validating the validation, because I see it, and maybe you see it too, Jon, I don't know. I see a lot of companies doing validations that, in my opinion, are totally meaningless because they're doing the wrong validation. So what good is doing a validation and passing your validation, showing that you've validated, if you're doing the wrong validation? What do you think of that, Jon?
It sounds like a checkbox, Mike. Sounds like I'm just trying to get a check mark so I can move on to something else. But it's a fair point, and let's just say, not that my thinking is completely different from what it was back in December of 2014, but I will say it has evolved. I don't think in 2014 I appreciated the whole notion of total product lifecycle such that I do today. I guess sort of in that bucket of total product lifecycle are things like design changes, it's a really good point, validating your validation methods. How do you know that this result of this validation study, activity, trial, whatever the case may be, how do I know that it's actually valid? And I think there's this whole feedback loop that sometimes we as an industry forget about, call it design changes, whatever you want to call it. But, as your product is in use, and you should be learning, there's no such thing as a perfect medical device. I mean, I should be doing the prudent engineering and the necessary due diligence to make sure that the product that I'm putting out there is safe and effective to the best of my knowledge. And once people start using it, I'm going to learn something. And guess what? You're probably not going to learn anything that you captured in your design history file or that you already thought of in your risk assessment, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to learn things that you never thought of before and couldn't have imagined. And, wouldn't it have been nice maybe to have uncovered that before it went to market? Maybe. But the point is, keep learning, keep iterating, keep evolving, keep making your products safer and better and more effective for patients.
I absolutely agree, Jon. But on the other hand, those words are easy to say, but what do they really mean in reality, in the real world? And just to close the loop on what I call validating the validation, because I just have one more topic I wanted to bring up based on my original podcast and your blog response. A lot of the recommendations that I make come not just from my experience in regulatory and quality, but in my product liability experience. if I can show, and I've done this in a number of cases, that the company validated the product and the FDA bought in on their validation, but if I can show that they did the wrong validation, they didn't validate their validation, so to speak, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. Right. So it goes back to what you just mentioned and what we've talked about many times, that checkbox on the form. What good is doing a validation if you're not doing the right validation? What good is doing a validation if you haven't validated your validation, and so on and so on? The last thing that I thought I would bring up, Jon, and it's one of my many favorite topics to talk about, and it's another thing that you kind of called me out on in your blog response, and that is the topic of risk, and specifically how it relates to off-label use and anticipated misuse. And for the last time, Jon, I'll throw your words back in you one more time.
All right.
You said in your blog, because I made the comment, I was talking about how we're not required to address risks associated with off-label use in the design controls or in any of the regulation. And you responded by saying you, meaning the company, I think, must address off-label use as part of your risk management documentation. In fact, considering how the product will be used correctly and how it could be used incorrectly is a major benefit of following the design control and risk management practices, whether we're talking about ISO 14971 or the design controls or whatever it is. And here's where it gets interesting because, and again, this is not a criticism, Jon, but I think you are doing what many people are doing here, and that is they're equating what the design controls call anticipated misuse with off-label use. And in my view, Jon, those are absolutely not the same thing, and here's why. Because there are many examples where the standard of care, what we teach in medical school, is actually the off-label use of a product. This is not true for just medical devices. This is true for drugs. This is true for biologics, combination products, you name it. So if there's something, the standard of care, in other words, what we teach in medical school, it's off-label use. It might be off-label use, but how can we say that's anticipated misuse if that's, in fact, what we're teaching people to do? Does that make sense, Jon? How would you connect those dots?
Yeah, I think so. And from December 2014 to present day, you and I have talked about this particular topic a fair amount. And it is, in some veins or some ways of looking at it, it can be a slippery slope. I think I still stand behind what I'm about to say pretty vehemently. I think it's important as I'm designing a product that I have to think about usability. I have to think about how people can do things the wrong way. But to your point, that's a little bit different than off-label. But I think at the same time, there are cases, specific cases, and the classic example in our industry is the good old biliary stent device. I remember once upon a time, I think there were more products that had found the, quote, loophole in the process, if you will, and brought to market a biliary stent knowing full well that the stent was never going to be used for biliary indications, knowing full well that the stent was going to be used for coronary indications.
Yes.
And I think that was the point I was trying to emphasize here. If I'm designing a product knowing full well that it's going to be used for something completely different than what I'm labeling it as or what I'm getting clearance or approval for, then that is, I'm doing the wrong thing as a product developer.
Well, as a former stent designer myself, Jon, I can tell you back in the day, you mentioned the biliary stent. It's one of my favorite examples. 90% was off-label use. 90%, which meant that only 10% was on label. Now, I don't want you or anybody else in our audience to miss my message. From an engineering's perspective, as a professional biomedical engineer, I agree 110%, maybe more, that testing our device and designing our device to be used, not just the way that it's to be used in the theoretical world of regulatory affairs where everybody reads and follows the regulation, but in the real world of the practice of medicine, I think that's first and foremost the most important thing. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. However, I'm simply pointing out that from a regulatory / quality perspective, that's not exactly where we set the bar. Should we, adjust that regulation, I would be the first to say, let's have a discussion on exactly how to do that. But that's the point that I'm trying to make here.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And like I said, there's layers and levels of gray for sure. I think the point is, number one, I need to make sure I'm designing the device in a way that factors in misuse, either intentional or unintentional. I need to understand if it's intentional or off-label use. I need to understand what that's all about, and I may or may not address that. But if I know full well that my product is going to be used for something completely different than the way I'm labeling it, and that's why I'm bringing this product to market, then I need to question my practices. That's all I'm trying to say on this.
On that point, and on all of the points that we're talking about today, Jon, I could not agree more. The last thing that I just want to mention in the blog, because I need to try to correct a little bit from my end, one of the things that you included was apparently a direct quote from me. I didn't listen to my podcast over again.
Okay.
And so, but I'll assume that you got the quote right. Let me read the quote. It says, and this is you, Jon, quoting me, "Having a design control system in place is holding us back. Don't just follow the rules. If the rules make sense, go ahead. If the rules do not make sense, then don't follow them. If a rule is to my advantage, then yes, I will follow it," meaning me. "If the rule is not to my advantage, then I will carve out a new path." Now, whether or not those were my direct words, I don't know. I haven't listened to the podcast again, but let me try to explain what I mean, or what I tried to mean, because this is a very important point, and it's something that some people have asked me about in the past. I'm not saying don't follow the rules. I'm not, advocating anarchy. My message is very, very simple. If the rules make sense, follow them. But if the rules don't make sense, whether we're talking about the design control rules or anything else, if the rules don't make sense and we follow them anyway, and we all agree that they don't make sense, and yet we follow them anyway, and let's be honest, Jon, every single week of my career, and sometimes every day, I see companies doing things, following rules that just simply don't make sense, and follow it anyway. Is it a problem with the system, or is it a problem with us? So if you genuinely believe, and this is something that I do in my professional practice, Jon, a lot, if you genuinely believe that the rules, that the guidance, that whatever you're following doesn't make sense, please take it to the FDA prophylactically and say, here's what the regulation says, here's what the guidance says, here's why it doesn't make sense or it's not possible in our particular case, and here's what we're going to do instead. And 90% or more of the time, Jon, when I do that, as long as my arguments are based on the biology and the engineering, forget about the regulation. That's the least important. I'm going to get myself in trouble now because somebody's going to quote me, "Oh, this wackadoodle Drues guy said regulation doesn't matter." No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, well, you're laughing, Jon, but in this 30-second sound bit society that we live in, those are the snippets that people hear that get reported. Don't get me started when I'm interviewed by the popular press and they take a 30-minute interview and they snip out one or two little sentences from the middle that are totally out of context. So if the rules don't make sense, go to the FDA and work with them to explain, okay, this is what the rule says and it doesn't make sense and here's what we're going to do instead. That, in my opinion, Jon, is the way this game is supposed to be played. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think reading this, I mean, it was certainly a trip down memory lane, reviewing some of this information. And, again, a lot has certainly changed about your and my relationship from 2014 to today. And, what I've learned to appreciate about you, you're not saying if the rules don't apply, forget it and don't do anything. You're just saying, explain why it doesn't. Provide a rationale and a justification. It's not just because you don't feel that a quote rule applies to you isn't a free ticket to be an anarchist and say, screw it all, I'm not doing anything. I still have to make my case. I still have to explain my rationale. It's not an excuse for still being a prudent engineer and having the responsibility of designing and developing a safe product. That's not what you're saying. I don't know that the previous version of myself back in 2014 when I listened to your podcast, I don't know that I appreciated that, to be quite honest with you. Certainly not the way that I do today. Mike, any other thoughts to wrap things up today?
Yeah, just to wrap up that, I'll leave you with two final thoughts. One is one of my many favorite quotes to tie up our last discussion about following the rules. This is a slide that I end many of my regulatory presentations with. It's a quote from General Douglas MacArthur, who said, "Rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind." I think it's become a convenient excuse for a lot of people to justify not just what they do, but what they don't do by simply reading and following the rules. And again, as you just reiterated, rules are important, no question about it, but we should not be reading and following regulation like a mindless automaton, like a computer executing lines of code one after another without asking, does this make sense? And then the last thing that I would offer, Jon, especially for the benefit of the younger folks in our audience, I would just remind everybody when it comes to design controls, you alluded to the design control guidance document, Jon, which goes back to 1997, and I agree with you. Many people have said to the FDA that guidance should be updated. I say absolutely not.
Leave it alone.
That's a leave it alone. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. What we need to is people more understanding what's in it as opposed to creating more.
Amen.
But anyway, I just wanted to remind everybody that when I started out in this business as an R&D engineer in the early 1990s, this was long before the design controls even existed. We had lots less regulation today than we do today. Fast forward almost 3 decades later, we have thousands and thousands of pages of regulation, including the design controls. But the question is, are medical devices really any better? Is the world a better place? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, Jon. But back in those early days, we didn't have a lot of regulation. We didn't have the design controls in place. And yet somehow, I don't know how this happened, Jon, somehow we were able to get reasonably decent medical devices onto the market. Fast forward to today, 3 decades later, we've got thousands of pages of regulation. The question is the world a better place? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question, Jon, something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, thank you so much for this, like I said, this jog down memory lane. And, it's, I think it's one of, as you and I have talked about it now almost 6 years later, it's still one of those topics that unfortunately is more top of mind than it should be. I think, hopefully, maybe this is a little bit of my altruism coming through, but I hope people are starting to realize how important it is to be thorough and as complete as you possibly can be in a validated way during our product development efforts. Again, remember, patients' lives are at the end of this. I mean, you're designing and developing a product to improve the quality of life. So put that same sort of rigor and passion and focus into your design and development efforts.
I couldn't agree more. And just as a lead into maybe a future discussion, in this era of evidence-based medicine, or what some people today refer to as comparative effectiveness research, what I'm looking for is evidence that all of this additional regulation, including the design controls, is ultimately making the world, or at least our industry, a better place. And regrettably, Jon, I don't see a lot of it, and here's why. Because to this day, I still see companies getting 43 observations and sometimes warning letters because they don't do some of the most basic things. And maybe one of our next conversations, we can talk about some specific examples. But I'm talking about things like there was a company recently in the news, a major medical device company that makes permanent implants. FDA dinged them because they did not have an adequate post-market surveillance system in place. Major Fortune 100 medical device company with permanent implants not doing sufficient post-market surveillance. Another company apparently made changes to a device already on the market. And never mind, special 510K versus letter to file. I could care about that. The company apparently did not do the most basic engineering testing to show that those changes that they made in their device did not impact the safety, efficacy, performance, and so on of the device. I'm sorry, Jon, but this is going to sound very, very harsh to some people. Maybe I'm just getting old, but people don't know that people that don't know that they should do those things, whether they're required by the FDA or not, they should not be in this business.
I totally agree.
As you pointed out many times, we're talking about people's lives here, and some stuff to me is just basic information.
Yeah, I agree. And, we'll let that be the final word. And I guess I'll just pile on that just a little bit. There's no amount of regulation that's going to prevent that. That's just called being a good human and understanding what's right for the people that are going to be using your product. So I agree. But yeah, we'll dive into that later. Folks,
I used to teach in engineering school. What I call
go ahead. I was just getting ready to wrap up, but go ahead. I'm on the edge of my seat, wondering what they used to teach in engineering school.
No, that's we can wrap this up. I was just simply going to end by saying, as I've talked about before, I consider everything into design controls and pretty much everything in the regulation overall to be basic engineering, prudent engineering. What we used to teach in engineering school,
yeah.
I'm just not sure, John, and I do teach, in engineering today. I'm just not sure if we still teach that stuff or not. But that's a topic of a discussion at a pub sometime, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that it probably is, folks.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, Mike, thanks so much. As always, I look forward to these opportunities to talk about the things that are impacting our industry. So, folks, it's Mike Drues with Vascular Sciences. And as always, I want to thank you all for taking a moment out of your day to listen to this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Continue to spread the word and keep the Global Medical Device Podcast as the number one podcast in the medical device industry. As always, this is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, Jon Speer, and you have been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.